My son-in-law was the one who handed me the folded program at my daughter's funeral. He stood beside me at the graveside, one hand on my shoulder, his eyes red and swollen. He looked like a man destroyed by grief. I believed that. God help me, I believed every bit of it. My daughter Renee was 34 years old when she died. 34. She had her mother's laugh and her grandfather's stubbornness, and she made the best tourtière I've ever eaten in my life, including her grandmother's. She died on a Tuesday in late October, just as the maples along our street in Barrie were dropping the last of their leaves. The doctors said it was a cardiac event. Unexpected. Tragic. These things happen sometimes in otherwise healthy young women, they told me. They were very sorry for my loss. I drove home from the hospital that night alone. My wife passed 8 years ago, breast cancer, and Renee was all I had left. My son lives out in Kelowna, and we talk on the phone, but we were never close the way Renee and I were. She used to call me every Sunday morning. Every single Sunday, without fail, even after she married. I'd pick up and she'd say, "Hi, Dad, what did you have for breakfast?" And I'd say, "Same as always," and she'd say, "Oatmeal is not a personality, Dad." That was our thing. That was just our thing. After the funeral, I went back to my house and sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning the lights on. Her husband, I'll call him my son-in-law because I can barely stand to write his name, stood in the receiving line looking shattered. Everyone kept going to him. Everyone kept hugging him, asking how he was holding up. He was handsome and soft-spoken, and people liked him. I had liked him too, at the beginning. He worked in commercial real estate, and he wore good shoes, and he remembered people's names. Renee had met him at a work event in Toronto 4 years before she died. They got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard Niagara-on-the-Lake. I danced with her to a Van Morrison song, and I cried and she laughed at me for crying. He moved into her house in Barrie after the wedding. She owned it outright. She'd bought it herself before they met. With money she'd saved and a little help from the inheritance her mother left her. I remember thinking at the time that I was glad she had that security. I remember thinking that. About 2 weeks after the funeral, I got a call from her family doctor, Dr. Poulin. I'd met her once or twice at Renee's appointments when Renee had asked me to drive her. My daughter had a minor heart condition, a mitral valve issue that had been monitored since her 20s. Nothing considered serious, but it meant she saw Dr. Poulin regularly. I recognized her name on my phone, but I assumed she was calling to offer condolences, maybe to handle some administrative paperwork. I almost didn't answer. "Mr. Beaumont," she said. "That's my name, Claude Beaumont. I need to ask you to come into the office, not over the phone, in person." She paused. "And I'd prefer if you didn't mention this call to your son-in-law." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone with both hands like it might fall. "Is something wrong?" I asked, which was a stupid question. Everything was already wrong. My daughter was dead. "Please just come in," she said. "Tomorrow morning if you can." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and tried to think of what a doctor could possibly need to tell me privately, 2 weeks after my daughter's death, that she couldn't say over the phone and didn't want her husband to know about. I told myself it was probably administrative, probably something about her medical records or a billing issue with the insurance, or maybe Dr. Poulin had noticed something she felt guilty about missing and wanted to explain herself. I told myself all of that, but the way her voice had sounded, careful, low, like someone choosing every word, kept pulling me back. I was at her office on Dunlop Street at 8:45 the next morning. Dr. Poulin was a small woman in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head. She closed the door to her office herself, and sat across from me and folded her hands on the desk, and didn't say anything for a moment. I've replayed that silence many times since. "Mr. Beaumont," she said finally, "I want to start by saying that I'm not certain of anything. What I'm about to tell you is something I noticed in Renee's last blood work. from the appointment she had 6 weeks before she died. I didn't act on it at the time because there was a plausible explanation and her other markers looked stable. But after she passed, after the manner of her passing, I've had trouble letting it go. She slid a printed sheet across the desk to me. I don't have a medical background, so most of it meant nothing to me, but she walked me through it slowly. Renee's warfarin levels. Warfarin is a blood thinner. Renee had been prescribed a low dose of it 2 years earlier because of a clotting risk associated with her heart condition. Dr. Poulin had been monitoring those levels every few months. At the last appointment, the levels were significantly elevated, not dangerously so on paper, not enough to trigger an immediate alarm, but higher than they should have been given Renee's prescribed dosage. I asked Renee about it at the appointment, Dr. Poulin said. She told me she might have missed a few days and then doubled up. It happens. I noted it and told her to be more careful, and we moved on. She took off her glasses and set them on the desk. But Mr. Tent, Beaumont, elevated warfarin over time, in someone with a pre-existing mitral valve condition, significantly increases the risk of a hemorrhagic cardiac event, which is what killed your daughter. I heard what she was saying. It took me a minute to fully hear it, but I heard it. You're saying someone was giving her extra doses, I said. I'm saying the levels don't fully make sense to me, she said carefully. I'm not a forensic pathologist. I'm not making an accusation. But I have a patient who is dead, and a test result that has been bothering me for 2 weeks. I thought her father should know. Why didn't you call the police? I asked. She looked at me steadily. Because I have no proof. Because there's a reasonable explanation that doesn't involve foul play. Because if I report without evidence, I risk my professional reputation and potentially alert someone who might destroy evidence before an investigation even begins. And because she hesitated. Because I wanted to look her father in the eye first and see what he thought. I sat in that chair for a long time after she finished talking. Here's what I knew about my son-in-law by that point. I knew he had relocated from Calgary to be with Renee, and that he had no family nearby. I knew he worked long hours and traveled for work frequently. I knew he had, on at least 3 occasions that Renee mentioned to me in passing, suggested they update their wills and insurance policies, once before the wedding, once shortly after, and again about a year before she died. Renee had told me the last time with a small laugh, said he was very practical about these things. I hadn't thought anything of it. I was a retired high school history teacher from Barrie, Ontario. I didn't think in those terms. I knew one other thing. 3 days before the funeral, when I had come to the house to help with arrangements, I had gone upstairs to use the bathroom and passed the bedroom and seen, on the nightstand on what had been Renee's side of the bed, a prescription bottle that I didn't recognize. I hadn't looked closely. I hadn't thought to look closely. I wish, with everything I have, that I had looked closely. I drove home from Dr. Poulin's office, and I sat at my kitchen table again, and I wrote down everything I could remember. Then I called my son in Kelowna. His name is Matthew, and he's 41, and he works in forestry, and he is not someone who panics. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. "Dad," he said, "don't do anything yet. Let me come out." Matthew flew in 2 days later. We sat in my kitchen, and we talked through what we knew and what we didn't know, and what we needed to find out. The first thing we agreed on was that we needed to know more about the insurance. Renee had mentioned updating their policies, but I didn't know the details. I didn't know who the beneficiary was or how much coverage was involved. It turned out to be quite a lot. I found out through a contact of Matthew's, a friend of his from university who worked in financial services in Toronto. Without getting into the specifics of how, we confirmed that my son-in-law was the sole beneficiary of 2 life insurance policies on Renee, totaling just over $900,000. One of them had been taken out when they first got married, which wasn't unusual. The second had been added 18 months before she died. 18 months. Around the same time, he had brought up updating the policies again. I am 63 years old. I spent 30 years teaching teenagers about the Second World War and the FLQ crisis and the residential school system. I thought I understood something about how cruelty works in the world, how it justifies itself, how it hides inside ordinary-looking things. But I was not prepared for the feeling of understanding, slowly and then all at once, that the man who had handed me my daughter's funeral program and stood weeping beside her grave had very likely killed her. There is no framework for that. There is no historical lesson that prepares you. We went to the OPP. The Ontario Provincial Police have a unit that handles major crimes, and Mathieu had done enough research to know we needed to go to them rather than the local detachment, given the circumstances. We brought everything we had. Dr. Perfist, Poulin's notes, which she had agreed to provide, the insurance information, the timeline, Mathieu and I had constructed. The detective we spoke to was a woman named, I'll just say her first name, Isabelle. She was calm and thorough, and she did not dismiss us. That mattered more than I can say. After everything, having someone sit across from me and take notes and say keep going, it mattered. What the investigators found over the following months was this. My son-in-law had a woman in Toronto. She lived in a condo in Liberty Village, and he had been seeing her for at least 2 years before Renee died. Phone records. Credit card statements for dinners, hotels, a weekend in Mont-Tremblant. When investigators looked at his financial situation more carefully, they found that he had significant debt, not the kind that shows up obviously, but the accumulated kind. Private loans, lines of credit drawn down quietly over several years. He was not the successful man he presented as. He was performing success on credit while the walls closed in around him. Renee's house, Renee's inheritance, Renee's life insurance. The toxicology report. When investigators requested a full re-examination of the samples from the hospital, confirmed chronic elevation of warfarin, consistent with supplemental dosing over a period of weeks. Not something that happens by accident, not something that happens from missing a few doses and doubling up. Something that happens when someone is, over time, increasing your medication without your knowledge. There had been a pill organizer. Renee was diligent about her medications. She used one of those weekly organizers, the kind with the little compartments for each day. She had told me once she kept it on the kitchen counter so she wouldn't forget. Her husband would have had access to it every single morning. When the police searched the property, my son-in-law had already sold it by the time the investigation began, which was its own kind of evidence of something. They were unable to recover the organizer, but they found, in records from a pharmacy in the Cookstown area 30 kilometers from Barrie, a prescription for warfarin filled twice under a name that took some unraveling. It wasn't his name. It was a name connected to a numbered company that connected, eventually, back to him. These things take time. These things require patience and a kind of cold, steady attention that I had to work very hard to maintain while it all unfolded. His girlfriend, the woman in Liberty Village, cooperated with investigators after it became clear she was looking at charges herself. She knew, she said, that he had been increasing Renee's medication. She said she hadn't understood what that meant at first. She said a lot of things. I don't know how much of it I believe. I don't know how much of it is true versus how much is the version of events that gets you a reduced charge. What I know is that she testified, and her testimony, combined with the pharmacy records and the toxicology and the financial evidence, was enough. My son-in-law was charged with first-degree murder. His girlfriend was charged as an accessory. The trial was held in Barrie, about 12 minutes from the house where Renee grew up. I sat in that courtroom for 9 days. Mathieu sat beside me, my daughter's best friend. A woman named Sylvie, who had known Renee since elementary school, sat behind us. He did not testify. His lawyer made arguments about the reliability of toxicological evidence and the circumstantial nature of the financial motive and the credibility of a cooperating witness who had her own deal with the Crown. The jury deliberated for 4 days. I did not sleep during those 4 days. I sat in my kitchen in Barry, and I did not sleep. And I ate very little, and Matthew stayed in the spare room, and we did not talk much. We just existed in the same space the way you do when you are waiting for something that feels like it could go either way. The verdict came in on a Thursday afternoon in March. First-degree murder. Guilty. I want to tell you that I felt relief. I want to tell you that something lifted. In some ways, something did. The particular unbearable tension of not knowing, of the verdict being still ahead of you, that released. But the thing underneath it, the thing that has been underneath all of it from the moment Dr. Poulin slid that bloodwork across her desk, that didn't lift. That doesn't lift. My daughter is still in the ground in a cemetery on the north side of Barry, and she should be calling me on Sunday mornings to ask what I had for breakfast. He received a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years under the Criminal Code of Canada. His girlfriend received 8 years. I read both sentences in the same courtroom where I had spent 9 days looking at the back of his head. Afterwards, outside the courthouse, Sylvie hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Mathieu stood beside us with his hands in his coat pockets, looking up at the sky. It was a cold March day, the kind of cold that is almost done but not quite, and the parking lot had old gray snow pushed up against the edges. I've gone back to teaching, in a small way. I volunteer at the library on Tuesday afternoons, helping adults who are working toward their high school equivalency. There's a man in his 50s who is learning to read properly for the first time, and every week he arrives a few minutes early and sits with his textbook open, and I think Renee would have liked knowing about that. She had her mother's instinct for other people's dignity. I still have the Sunday habit. I wake up early and I make oatmeal and I sit at the kitchen table, and sometimes I pick up my phone out of reflex before I remember. The phone doesn't ring at 9 a.m. anymore. It doesn't ring. But I sit there anyway, with the oatmeal, and I think about her laugh and her stubbornness and the way she used to roll her eyes at me with complete affection. And I think, I didn't give up when it mattered most, when it would have been so much easier to accept what they told me and go home and grieve quietly. I didn't give up. She deserved that. She deserved someone who didn't stop until the truth was in a courtroom and on the record and in the newspaper and impossible to ignore. She was my daughter, and she deserved that much from me. I'm sorry it took a doctor's phone call to make me see what was right in front of me. I'm sorry I shook his hand at her graveside and said the things you say. I'm sorry I didn't look at that prescription bottle on the nightstand when I had the chance. But I didn't stop. That's the thing I hold on to now. Whatever else I failed to do, I didn't stop. I keep thinking about the pill organizer. That small plastic thing sitting on Renee's kitchen counter, the kind you can buy at any Shoppers Drug Mart for $6. She was careful about her health. She was responsible and organized, and she trusted the person she had built a life with. And that trust, that ordinary, reasonable, completely human trust, was the thing that was used against her. There's a version of this story where I never get that phone call, where Dr. Poulin files the blood work away and decides she has no proof and moves on, where I grieve my daughter as a tragic loss to a heart condition, and my son-in-law collects nearly $1 million and starts over somewhere new with the woman from Liberty Village. That version exists. It almost happened. What stood between that version and the truth was one doctor who couldn't sleep, and one father who refused to accept the first explanation offered to him. I've thought a lot about what I actually did right, not the big things, not the OPP investigation or the trial, but the smaller things. Before any of that, I wrote things down. I called Mathieu instead of confronting my son-in-law in a moment of rage. I asked questions instead of making accusations. I let Isabel and her team do the work they were trained to do. None of that felt like wisdom at the time. It felt like the only thing I could manage to do without falling apart. But looking back, I understand that keeping your head when your heart is completely broken is its own kind of discipline. It doesn't come naturally. You have to choose it, over and over, when everything in you wants to do something else. What my son-in-law did was not just a crime. It was a calculated dismantling of someone who loved him. He made himself into something trustworthy and then used that trust as a tool. And the thing about that kind of harm is that it doesn't just hurt the person it's aimed at. It poisons the way everyone around them learns to see the world afterward. I catch myself sometimes, with people I'd known for years, noticing things I never would have noticed before. A slight hesitation, a story that doesn't quite line up. I don't like that I do that. But I also understand now that paying attention is not the same as suspicion. Caring about the people you love means staying present enough to notice when something is wrong, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the most convenient thing to do is accept the easy answer. Renee deserves someone in her life with that kind of attention. I wish I had given it to her sooner. I wish I had looked more carefully, asked more questions, taken the small signs more seriously before it was too late to matter. That's the weight I carry. Not guilt exactly. I know I couldn't have known what I didn't know. But a kind of permanent sharpness. A reminder that love without attentiveness is incomplete. What I want anyone watching this to take away is simpler than it sounds. When something doesn't sit right, don't talk yourself out of it for the sake of keeping the peace. Real integrity means being willing to follow an uncomfortable truth even when every part of you would rather not. Real intelligence means asking the next question instead of stopping at the first satisfying answer. And real strength, the kind that actually matters, isn't aggression. It's the ability to stay steady and clear-headed when you are devastated, and to keep going when giving up would be so much easier. I kept going for Renee, and she got her justice because of it.